Welcome to FT Word. Aspiration is the new buzzword in British politics, with all parties keen to show they're there to help working people build a better future. But in one important dimension, housing, Britain's politicians are failing their voters, as skyrocketing house prices make it impossible for many first-time buyers to put their first foot on the property ladder. What are the causes of Britain's housing crisis, and what can be done to solve it? Discussing this with me is Christian Hilber, Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics. Welcome, Christian. So let's have a look at the first chart which you brought with you, and it shows that actually it's very much a London phenomenon in the UK.
It's not just a London phenomenon, but it is most clear in London and the southeast of the country. Yes.
So what you see is that London house prices have really grown much faster than GDP since the 1970s.
In London.
In the UK, it's roughly at the same pace.
Yes, yes, but so you need to, so these are real house prices, and so this means that if house prices would have grown at the same pace as other prices, this line will be pretty much flat. But actually what you see here is that house prices have grown in real terms, and actually compared to other countries, quite extraordinarily.
We can see that in the second chart, which shows really the comparison between London real house prices, UK real house prices, and then Switzerland and the US. And what we see here is that really the difference is quite dramatic.
Yes, so in Switzerland, for example, which has a rather flexible planning system, house prices have grown in real terms since 1975 by less than 40%. In the US, it's 62%, and if you look at the UK, by 150%, and in London, it's by over 300%.
So they're basically 4 times as high as they were
in 1975 in real terms.
That's pretty dramatic. And I mean, you were talking about the planning system, and we can get into more detail now that we are in moving to the third chart. Now, what we see here is how the number of permanent dwellings completed has actually been falling since the 70s, and while real house prices have been going up. So that's really basic demand and supply, isn't it?
Yes, so usually you would expect the other way around. So if prices increase, that gives strong incentives for developers to provide more housing. But actually in the UK, construction since 1970 has been going down pretty steadily.
And that, obviously one can explain rising house prices by the shortage of supply in a way.
Exactly, yes.
And so what are you're saying the planning system is really to blame here?
Yes.
What in particular?
So the planning system is extraordinarily rigid by international standards. So the planning system focuses on urban containment. So we have green belts around British cities, and so you can't build horizontally, you can't build, further out. But at the same time, we also have height restrictions, so you can't build higher up. And we have conservation areas and all sorts of other constraints. So that really makes it very difficult to add new housing supply.
So what is it to be done? What would be your recommendation to politicians?
So let me first perhaps say a few more words about the rigidity and where it comes from. So one reason is NIMBYism. So not in my own backyard behavior. Near the greenbelt, you might say bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So people don't like construction in their backyard, and that's understandable. That's similar to other countries. But what's different in the UK is that local authorities, which make the planning decisions, essentially have no fiscal incentives to permit development. So they have the cost of development, but very little revenue. So this imposes these constraints. So, coming back to your question, I think what one ought to do is, well, 2 things. One can try to reform the planning system and try to reform it in such a way to make more land available for construction, or one can reform the tax system. So right now we have a council tax, and that's a really not a good tax. It creates very little revenue at the local level. It's not proportional to house values. It was last assessed in '92. So one way to reform, one thing to do would be to introduce a proper property tax, possibly get rid of the stamp duty, which is another very distorting tax, and have a revenue-neutral new tax, which is a property tax, which replaces the council tax and the stamp duty.
Well, Christian, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So here's a menu of options for British politicians. Let's see if they're really serious about meeting people's aspirations.